biggest exchange in last night's Republican debate was over Social Security and whether it amounts to a Ponzi scheme or not. Let's listen to it.
It is a Ponzi scheme to tell our kids that are 25 or 30 years old today, you're paying into a program that's going to be there. Anybody that's for the status quo with Social Security today is involved with a monstrous lie to our kids, and it's not right.
Our nominee has to be someone who isn't committed to abolishing Social Security, but who's committed to saving Social Security. We have always had, at the heart of our party, a recognition that we want to care for those in need, and our seniors have the need of Social Security.
You cannot keep the status quo in place and not call it anything other than a Ponzi scheme. It is. That is what it is. Americans know that, and regardless of what anyone says, oh, it's not, and that's provocative language, maybe it's time to have some provocative language in this country.
Wow. Anyway, Rick Perry's not backing away from that Ponzi scheme characterization. How will the Republican race roll out if Social Security is a major issue in the campaign? And how could that affect President Obama's 2012 strategy in facing the eventual nominee? Todd Harris is a Republican strategist. Steve McMahon is a Democratic strategist. For the record book, for all those watching, especially those who respect your thinking, Todd Harris, was that a mistake?
Yeah, he made a mistake.
Okay.
It wasn't a mistake in what he said. He made a mistake with what he didn't say. If you're going to use language like Ponzi scheme in describing Social Security, you sure as hell better have a plan in place to actually save it. The Republican base...
A Ponzi scheme, by the way, for most people to understand it, is generally meant to be something like a chain letter. You basically pay the next person off with the money you just got from somebody else, but it's not making any money.
And eventually someone ends up holding an empty bag.
Right.
If you're going to talk about reforming Social Security, which, by the way, both parties should be doing because it's going broke. If you're going to talk about it, you need to talk about reforming it in order to save it. The Republican base wants to hear candidates talk openly and honestly about Social Security reform in order to save it. And I think that they will reward you. You know, Marco Rubio was elected in Florida talking about this, but you have to talk about saving.
It sounds like he hates the idea.
Yes.
Of taxing people basically while they're in their working years to get them benefits in their retiring years. He doesn't like that idea.
He doesn't like it. He actually has suggested implicitly that that might even be unconstitutional. And, you know, I don't normally advise Republican candidates, but here's a piece of free advice for Rick Perry. If you're going to get involved in generational warfare, you want to stand with the generation that votes. Not the generation that doesn't vote. And the older people who rely and depend on Social Security and the people who are coming up on Social Security aren't really that interested in electing a president who thinks it's a failure. And that's the bigger problem.
Now, do you think this, deep down, I know you're a partisan, you're both partisan, everybody sort of watches the show is partisan, but do you really believe that he can't fix this?
Well, here's what I think. I think
can he fix it?
He could probably fix the Ponzi scheme part because the Ponzi scheme is, you know, many people would agree with that. The thing he can't walk back is what Mitt Romney cleverly and smartly latched onto, which is in his book he says, by any measure, Social Security is a failure. He's not backing away from that. He's not backing away from Ponzi.
It sounds like the raw Ronald Reagan, the very early Reagan that railed against a lot of the New Deal, not the New Deal, the Great Society, didn't like Medicare, and then toned it down.
Yeah, and that's when he won. I think there's no question for me. I think he can recover from this. Certainly, there's a long way to go. But if you're going to use incendiary language and you don't have a plan to actually save it, you've got to be very careful because voters are going to think that you don't want it. Let's go back to everybody.
Half the people watch the show are in that age group and some are younger. But let's go back to the simple fact. The genius of Franklin Roosevelt, who was a great president, maybe one of the greatest 2 or 3, I think, was that he figured out that Social Security had to be for everybody, no means test, you paid for it while you worked. When you retired and had no other form of income, this would help you out. In fact, a lot of people were impoverished in the old days without Social Security. It's a great anti-poverty program. But then people started to live past 65. And even the great Franklin Roosevelt didn't make it to 65. In those days, if you made it to 65, you were lucky. You got a few bucks out of Social Security. Today, lots of people, fortunately, make it past 65. They live into their 80s and 90s. They're still getting those checks. The system doesn't work that way anymore. It's not as healthy as it once was. So how does a Republican deal with the fact it is a Ponzi scheme in the sense that the money that's paid out every day is coming from people who paid in that day, right? It's not being made somewhere.
That's absolutely right. And you will never get back the amount of money that you pay into it under its current structure.
Some people are going to do that. Well, certainly poor people do pretty well under it. That's the idea.
Many people actually get back much more than they paid, which is one of the problems. And the other problem is that for a long period of time, and you know this, Chris, you worked on the Hill, people paid into the Social Security Trust Fund, and it was set aside. And then the politicians decided, well, we're going to go get that money, and we're going to use it to pay for other things, and we'll make it up later. They borrowed against it. Yeah. So one of the reasons that it's become a Ponzi scheme, if that's what it is, and it's a pejorative term that's actually a criminal enterprise, is because the people in Washington haven't done.
Let's talk red meat. Why would a guy who seems to have his head on his shoulders, I don't agree with Perry, but he's not crazy, why does he think this works? To call it a criminal enterprise, basically to call it a monstrous lie, to use this infuriating language, and there are older people in South Florida who are going, wait a minute, I depend on that for my income. I don't like being told I'm part of a Ponzi scheme. Why does he risk it?
Well, this is certainly the tone that he has always used in his campaigns in Texas, and it's worked for him both in primary.
Beat your candidate.
Handily by 22 points. It's worked for him in primaries, and it's worked for him in general elections.
Why do Texans like this kind of language, Ponzi scheme language?
Well, it's aggressive. There's a certain swagger to it. It's big.
Coarseness to it.
Does he face a problem now if he buckles and begins to say, you know, that was the wrong language? A big moderator, Brian Williams or somebody, gets them to say under a Sunday show, or David Gregory, oh, I should have chosen different words. Does that weaken him on the right?
No, because he can say, look, he could say, you know what, it is a Ponzi scheme, but what I want to do now is talk about my plan to actually save it.
That's what I think is his opening.
And that's what
you guys aren't going to forget it, are you?
No, it's on tape, and that's going to be a problem because he's going to see that a lot. But listen, Rick Perry is an interesting candidate, but he's never really run a general election, and I don't mean that he hasn't been in a general election. I mean, in Texas, it's basically a one-party state. Bellicose rhetoric wins Republican primaries, not general elections.
You think he's the favorite or not?
I'm not so sure.
Do you think he's the favorite?
I think he's got a glass jaw.
This is the danger that Perry presents. If all of these issues, these are all side issues. These are distractions. Republicans should be talking about jobs and the economy. And if we're talking about science, Ponzi schemes, all of this, this is a distraction from what our message should be.
Todd, he's got our attention.
Yeah, he certainly did.
We're going to listen to this guy the next couple weeks now. Todd Harris, thank you, Steve McMahon. You guys are right in business now. Great time to have you. Up next.